What if the gate to heaven isn't a door you knock on, but a file that's already been opened before you get there? There is a passage in the Ethiopian Bible that describes, in far more procedural detail than anything in the Western Genesis to Revelation canon, what a soul actually faces at the gate of heaven. Not a parable, not a vague image of pearly gates and a guest list. A structured judgment scene with a presiding figure, a record being read, and specific categories of people singled out for exclusion. Categories that don't appear anywhere in the version most of the Western world was taught. That scene comes from the Book of Enoch, kept in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church's full 81-book canon for over 1,500 years, and removed from nearly every other Christian tradition on earth by the 4th century. Before we get into what that judgment scene actually says, hit like and subscribe, because once you hear the criteria, you'll understand exactly why keeping this text around made a lot of people in power very uncomfortable. The Western Protestant Bible contains 66 books. The Catholic Bible contains 73. The Ethiopian Bible contains 81. That gap didn't happen by accident. It reflects a real, documented set of decisions made at church councils between the 3rd and 5th centuries, decisions about which ancient texts would carry the weight of Scripture and which wouldn't. Ethiopian Christianity traces its roots to the 4th century mission of Frumentius, arriving directly rather than through Rome, which meant Ethiopia's church wasn't in the room for most of those later Western canon decisions. Texts that got trimmed from the Western Bible simply stayed exactly where they'd always been, in continuous use in Ethiopia. One of the real historical councils involved in shaping the Western canon was the Council of Laodicea, held sometime in the latter half of the 4th century. Its 60th canon lists the books considered acceptable for reading in church, and Enoch is not among them. This part is genuinely documented, not speculation. What's far less certain and worth being honest about up front is any specific claim about exactly what discussion happened in that room, what individual participants said to each other, or what precise reasoning was recorded about any single excluded text. Council records from this period are fragmentary at best. We have the outcome. We don't have a transcript of the deliberation. Any video, including this one, that claims to know the exact private reasoning of specific 4th century churchmen is dramatizing a gap in the historical record, not reporting from it. What we can say with confidence is broader and, honestly, more interesting than a single dramatic quote would be. Canon formation across the 4th and 5th centuries wasn't a single tidy event. It was a decades-long, regionally uneven process, with different councils, different bishops, and different Christian communities arriving at different conclusions about which texts counted as Scripture. Enoch fell out of favor gradually across most of that process, for reasons that likely included genuine theological disagreement, its unusual genre compared to the rest of the Hebrew Bible, and, plausibly, the kind of institutional discomfort a text about judgment for the powerful would create for anyone holding power. All of those explanations can be true at once. None of them require an invented smoking gun to be worth discussing. The Book of Enoch is the most consequential of those surviving texts, because large portions of the New Testament clearly assume familiarity with it. The Epistle of Jude quotes Enoch directly, by name, treating it as authoritative, which is remarkable when you consider that Jude itself made it into the Western canon while the text it quotes did not. Fragments of Enoch were also found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, confirming the text was in serious circulation among Jewish communities well before the time of Jesus, centuries before any Christian council ever debated including or excluding it. Enoch isn't a fringe addition to the Ethiopian canon. It's foundational scaffolding that the rest of the canon was built to sit on top of. The section of Enoch most relevant here is chapters 37 through 71, a unit scholars generally call the Book of Parables, or the Similitudes of Enoch. This section contains a detailed vision of final judgment, a presiding figure seated on a throne, a formal accounting of conduct, and specific groups described as excluded from that judgment's favor. The presiding figure is called, in most English translations, the Son of Man, or the Elect One. This is the same title used in the book of Daniel, and the same title Jesus uses to describe himself repeatedly throughout the Gospels. That overlap is not a coincidence Enoch scholars invented recently. It's one of the most discussed connections in the study of Second Temple Jewish literature, and it's a major reason scholars take the parables section as seriously as they do when trying to understand where early Christian language about judgment and divine authority actually came from. There's genuine scholarly debate about the exact relationship here, and it's worth being upfront about that rather than flattening it into a simple, one-directional claim. Some scholars argue the Gospel writers were directly influenced by Enoch's Son of Man imagery. Others argue both Enoch and the Gospels were independently drawing on the same older tradition rooted in Daniel, without one text necessarily borrowing from the other. What virtually nobody in the field disputes is that the imagery is closely related enough to be studied together, and that understanding one genuinely helps illuminate the other. That's a real, substantive academic conversation, not a fringe theory invented for a video script. Here's roughly what the judgment scene describes. The Elect One sits enthroned. The dead are brought before him. Their deeds are reviewed against an existing record, not confessed aloud in the moment. The imagery is closer to a formal accounting than to a worship service, and it's noticeably more procedural than most of what appears in the Western Bible's judgment language. The text draws a repeated distinction between two groups. On one side are the righteous and the oppressed, those who suffered under unjust conditions. On the other are, repeatedly, the kings and the mighty, described as having exploited or oppressed others through their position. This isn't a subtle undertone. It's one of the most consistent themes across the entire parables section, a searing critique of powerful people who use their position to harm those beneath them, and a promise that this exact accounting would eventually catch up with them, permanently and without appeal. Read that theme again with the historical timeline in mind. This is a judgment scene, written and copied for centuries before Christianity existed as an organized religion, that specifically and repeatedly singles out rulers and the powerful for the harshest treatment at final judgment, tied directly to how they used their authority against ordinary people. It's not a minor detail buried in a single obscure verse. It's the emotional and theological center of gravity for the entire section. Anyone reading the parables in full comes away with an unmistakable impression. Whatever else this judgment scene is about, it is deeply, repeatedly concerned with holding the powerful accountable to the people beneath them. Now, in fairness, it's worth being clear that the Western Bible isn't entirely silent on this theme either, and a good video on this topic shouldn't pretend otherwise. Matthew chapter 25 contains the well-known sheep and goats passage, where final judgment hinges on how people treated the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the sick, and the imprisoned. Luke's Gospel repeatedly emphasizes concern for the poor. Revelation describes books being opened at judgment, evoking the same idea of an existing record being reviewed rather than a fresh confession being taken on the spot. The concern for the vulnerable didn't vanish from Western Christianity. It's genuinely present. What's different is specificity and emphasis. The Western passages tend to describe judgment in broader, more universal terms, applied to everyone equally. Enoch's parables repeatedly and specifically name kings, and the mighty as a distinct category facing a distinct reckoning tied to how they used power, not just general kindness or cruelty. That's a sharper, more institutionally uncomfortable framing than "Did you feed the hungry?" It's closer to, did you use your position over other people to help them or to grind them down? That distinction between diffuse ethical instruction and pointed institutional accountability is real, even if it's a difference of emphasis and precision rather than a completely missing theme. This is where the historical picture gets genuinely interesting, and where you don't need any invented detail to make the story land. The councils that finalized the Western biblical canon in the 4th and 5th centuries were, by definition, made up of powerful religious and political figures deciding which texts would shape how ordinary believers understood divine judgment. A text whose central judgment scene repeatedly singles out the mighty, who abused their position for particularly severe consequences, is, at minimum, an awkward text for a council of powerful men to enshrine as core scripture. Whether that specific discomfort was ever written down as an explicit reason for excluding Enoch is not something we can verify from surviving council records with certainty, but the tension itself is real, textual, and doesn't require any fabricated smoking gun document to notice. What's also real is how differently the Ethiopian tradition has handled this material compared to the West. Scholars of Ethiopian Christianity have long noted that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church places a distinctive theological emphasis on justice toward the poor, the widow, and the orphan, categories that show up prominently across the broader Enoch tradition and in surrounding Second Temple Jewish literature more generally. That emphasis didn't develop in a vacuum. It developed in a church that never lost access to the fuller judgment material the West set aside. There's a genuinely important historical figure connected to how any of this reached the West at all. The Scottish explorer James Bruce brought Gaya's manuscripts of Enoch back to Europe in the 1770s after gaining access to Ethiopian monastic collections. Manuscripts that had been essentially inaccessible to Western scholarship for over 1,000 years. Those texts eventually made their way into English translation in the 19th and 20th centuries, work that opened the parables section to Western academic study for the first time in over a millennium. That part of the story is well documented and doesn't need any embellishment. It's genuinely remarkable on its own that this material survived at all, sealed away in monastery libraries for centuries, while it disappeared entirely from Western Christian tradition. Think about what that timeline actually means. For roughly 1,400 years, an entire tradition of Jewish and early Christian judgment literature, material the New Testament writers themselves were clearly reading, sat completely outside the awareness of the Christian world that had descended from Rome. Not because it had been destroyed, because it had simply been left out, carried forward instead by a church tradition operating an ocean and a continent away from the councils that mattered to Western Christianity's self-understanding. When European scholars finally got their hands on translated copies in the early 19th century, they were reading material that had never stopped being read continuously, just never by them. That story isn't finished either. Ethiopian churches, including the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum, hold manuscript collections that remain, by most accounts, only partially catalogued and studied by outside scholarship even today. Ethiopian church authorities have historically treated these manuscripts as sacred liturgical objects, rather than archival documents available for open academic access, which is understandable given their religious significance, but it also means Western scholarship's picture of exactly what these collections contain is genuinely incomplete. That's a real, ongoing gap, not a dramatic secret being actively concealed. 19th century scholars who worked with Ethiopian manuscripts did note, in general terms, that Ethiopian collections contained material beyond what circulated in European libraries at the time. That's a documented, unremarkable fact about how manuscript access worked in that era. It doesn't require inventing a specific, undisclosed discovery to be worth mentioning. Where the interpretation gets more speculative, and where honesty matters most, is in claims about a specific fourth criterion, involving truthfulness about historical record-keeping, something distinct from the poor, the widow, and the orphan. That's a much more contested and specific interpretive claim than the well-established themes around justice for the oppressed. Different translators and scholars have rendered the relevant Ge'ez and Aramaic terminology in meaningfully different ways over the past 2 centuries, and any confident claim about one single, precise, hidden fourth category, deliberately excised by a named council, should be treated as an interpretive theory rather than a settled textual fact. It's a genuinely interesting reading some people have proposed. It is not something you can point to as an uncontested consensus finding. It's also worth understanding where the parables section sits within the wider field of Second Temple Jewish literature, the body of Jewish religious writing produced roughly between the 6th century BCE and the 1st century CE, which includes everything from the later parts of the Hebrew Bible to a wide range of texts that never made it into any canon at all. Scholars in this field have long noted that judgment scenes emphasizing accountability for the powerful, care for the vulnerable, and the integrity of testimony and record-keeping weren't unique to Enoch. Similar concerns surface across multiple texts from the same broad period and milieu, including material found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. That context matters, because it means Enoch's judgment scene isn't some isolated outlier invented by one eccentric author. It reflects a broader current of ethical and theological concern running through Jewish religious thought in the centuries immediately before and after the time of Jesus, concern that early Christianity clearly inherited in some form, even as the Western Church later trimmed away several of the specific texts that had carried it. What can be said with real confidence is this: the Ethiopian Canon preserves a judgment scene with far more structural and ethical specificity than anything in the Western Bible's treatment of the same subject. It centers accountability for how the powerful treated the vulnerable. It was excluded from the mainstream Western canon at a moment in history when powerful religious authorities were actively deciding which texts believers would and wouldn't have access to. And it survived, fully intact, in a tradition that was never in the room when those Western decisions were made. Whether that exclusion reflects a specific, deliberate discomfort with a text that judged the powerful particularly harshly, or simply the ordinary, messier process by which ancient canons formed unevenly across different regions and centuries, is a genuinely open historical question. Both explanations are plausible. Neither one requires inventing a private letter that doesn't exist, or a scholar's quote that was never actually said. There's a third possibility worth naming, too, one that's less dramatic but arguably more unsettling in its own way. It's possible no single moment of deliberate suppression ever happened at all, and the exclusion of Enoch from the Western canon was simply what happens by default when texts fall out of liturgical use, get copied less often, and slowly drift toward obscurity without anyone making a dramatic decision to bury them. Under that reading, nobody sat in a room and decided the powerful shouldn't be held to this standard. The text simply stopped being reproduced as often as the texts that better served an increasingly institutionalized church, and after a few generations that quiet neglect became permanent. That explanation doesn't require a villain. It only requires ordinary institutional inertia, which, if anything, might be the most historically plausible explanation of the three. What's not in question is that this text exists, that it was read as authoritative for over a millennium by a church tradition largely ignored by Western scholarship until relatively recently, and that its picture of judgment, centered on how the powerful treated the powerless, is strikingly different in emphasis from what most people in the Western world were ever taught to expect at the gate. So here's where that actually leaves us. The manuscripts are real. The judgment scene is real. The theme of accountability for the powerful is one of the most well-documented features of the entire parables section, sitting right there in the text for anyone who reads it. What remains genuinely uncertain is exactly how deliberate the 4th century exclusion was, and exactly how far any single interpretive reading of the text's finer details should be trusted as settled fact, rather than one serious scholar's proposal among several competing ones. That uncertainty doesn't make the story less compelling. If anything, it makes it more honest. A text preserved for 1,500 years by a church tradition the rest of Christianity mostly forgot, describing a judgment scene that holds the powerful to account for how they treated everyone beneath them, doesn't need any invented archival letter to be worth taking seriously. If a 1,500-year-old text really does describe judgment differently than the version most of the world was handed, what else got quietly left out of the book everyone assumes they already fully know? That's exactly what we're opening next. Hit like if you want the forbidden chapters kept coming, and subscribe to stay with us as we keep reading what was never meant to leave the monastery.